Hey guys, glad you're here for the help video for quiz 4.04. Here is your need to know info. We are still dealing with trig ratios, so remember it's on your formula sheet. You do not have to memorize them, but you do need to have access to that formula sheet all the time. Alright? Also, just as a reminder, you got to be able to label your sides, opposite, adjacent, and hypotenuse. And lastly, we're going to be doing a lot of calculator work in this one. So you do need to know your specific calculator and where the buttons are that you need. So I'm going to try to show you a couple different calculators today in the help video. But I also want to just mention an inverse function is a function that cancels out, is the opposite of something else. So if you're adding 4, the inverse is to subtract 4. If you're multiplying by 3, the inverse operation is to divide by 3. If you're squaring something, the inverse is to square root. It's basically just the operation that will cancel that out. And so we're going to be doing some inverse trig functions today. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. But the button that you need for inverse trig functions is sine to the -1 power, or cosine to the -1 power, or tangent to the -1 power. That represents the inverse, or the opposite. Alright, so let's do this. What is the measure of angle A? So we're trying to figure out angle A. I'm going to mark that as theta. And then I'm going to label my sides based off of that angle. Remember, you always label your hypotenuse first, which is across from the 90-degree angle. The adjacent touches theta. And then the opposite is the side that's across from the reference angle. Okay, so this one's kind of cool because they give me all the side lengths of the triangle. So I can really pick any trig function that I want because I know all the sides. So I'm just going to pick sine since it's the very first one. So I'm going to use sine of theta equals the opposite, which is 4, over the hypotenuse, which is 5. Now my goal is to solve for theta. I'm trying to get that by itself. So I need to get rid of sine. And the opposite of sine is to use the inverse sine. So I'm going to put the inverse sine on each side. Kind of had to smush it in there. I should put this in parentheses. Okay. So the whole reason that I smushed that inverse sine in there is because sine and the sine inverse will cancel out, leaving me with just theta. That's my goal, is to solve for the angle. And now I'm going to have to go and I'm going to have to type in the inverse sine of 4/5 in my calculator. So I'm going to show you a couple different calculators. Alright, I'm going to start with my favorite calculator simply because it's my favorite. But if you look, we have the sine, cosine, and tangent buttons, and then right above it, in little yellow or green writing, you'll see the inverse functions. That means that we have to hit this yellow button first. I can't tell if that's yellow or green. Sorry, guys. But if I want to type in the inverse sine of 4/5, I'm going to hit second sine, which brings up that inverse sine, and then I'm going to use my fraction button and type in 4/5. That tells me that theta, the angle, is approximately 53.13 degrees. Let's look at some other calculators though, because each calculator is a little bit different. So if you're using a computer calculator, make sure it's in scientific form so that you actually have the buttons that you need. But instead of hitting a fraction 4/5, you want to do 4 divided by 5. Once you get that answer, 4 divided by 5, then you're going to hit the inverse sine button. So you have to type it in backwards when you use a computer calculator, but you'll get the same answer. So whichever calculator we type it in here, we're going to figure out that theta, or angle A, is approximately 53.13 degrees. Alright, so here's the next one. What is the measure of angle P? So I'm trying to figure out P. You can label it X or you can label it theta. I'm just going to go ahead and label it theta. Then, of course, we label each side of our triangle. So we have the hypotenuse, the adjacent, and the opposite. Again, we know all three of our sides, so we can pick any trig function we want. I'm going to go ahead and use cosine since I used sine last time, but it doesn't matter. You'll get the same thing no matter what. So I'm going to do cosine of theta equals the adjacent over the hypotenuse. And now I'm going to solve for theta because my goal is to figure out what that angle is. So in order to get theta by itself, I need to get rid of cosine. And the opposite of cosine, the inverse function, is to use the inverse cosine. So I'm going to smush that in on both sides. The reason I'm using that is because then the cosine and the inverse will cancel, leaving me with just theta. And now I need to type in my calculator the inverse cosine of 5 over 13. Now remember, you can either type it in exactly how it looks if you have this kind of calculator. So second cosine fraction 5 over 13. And it's approximately 67.38 degrees. If you don't have this calculator and you're using a computer calculator, then remember you need to do 5 divided by 13 first. Because that's what a fraction means. A fraction just means divide. So do 5 divided by 13 and then hit that inverse cosine button. Let me see if I can squeeze this calculator over here to show you. Okay, so we would do 5 divided by 13. And I have to be in full screen to get that inverse button, but then I would hit inverse cosine. What? Let me clear this out. What did I type in? 5 divided by 13, and then hit the inverse cosine. And I know I'm kind of cutting you off here, but we would get 67.38. All right, so our angle measure, angle P, maybe I should call it that, is approximately 67.38 degrees. Let's keep going. What is the measure of angle X? So again, I have my reference angle. I labeled my sides, hypotenuse, adjacent, opposite. This time, again, I know all three of my sides, so I'm just going to use tangent since we haven't used tangent yet. Tangent of theta equals the opposite side over the adjacent side. And I want to solve for theta. I want to know what the measure of angle X is, so I need to do the inverse of tangent on each side, because tangent and tangent inverse will cancel, leaving me with just theta. And then it is simply a calculator problem. So pick whichever calculator you have and type it in. I'll go ahead and do it on this one. So if I'm using my scientific calculator, graphing computer, goodness gracious, my computer calculator, I need to do 84 divided by 13 first. And then I need to hit inverse tangent. And remember, you have to make it full screen in order to see that. So here's my inverse tangent. And that gives me approximately 81.20 degrees. So the measure of angle X is approximately 81.20 degrees. All right, this one says, what is the measure of angle D? So D is my reference angle theta. Then you got to label your sides. Across from the 90 degree is hypotenuse. Touching the reference angle is adjacent. And across from the reference angle is the opposite. Now this problem I really like because we don't know all three sides. The only side that we know is the opposite and the adjacent. So we can't just pick any trig function that we want. We have to pick the trig function that has the opposite and the adjacent in it. So this one we have to use tangent. We are not given the option. So tangent of theta or tangent of D, whatever you want to call it, equals the opposite side, which is 25, over the adjacent side, which is 45. Since I'm trying to solve for theta or for that reference angle, I need to get rid of tangent. The opposite or the inverse is to do the inverse tangent on each side. Those will cancel, leaving me with theta. And then again, it is a calculator problem. So let's use this one this time. So I'm going to do second tangent to get that inverse tangent. And then by the way, I always use the fraction button, but I want you to see that you could just divide. You could do 25 divided by 45, because a fraction line just means division. So the measure of angle D is approximately 29.05. degrees. All right, last problem. This one says, a guy wire supports a cell phone tower. Oh, I always thought that was guide wire. Guess not. Sorry, I got distracted there. The guy wire makes a 55-degree angle with the ground and touches the ground 34 feet from the base of the tower. What is the length of the guy wire to the nearest foot? Okay, so this is our cell phone tower right here, and this is the wire that's attached to the ground. And that's what we're trying to figure out. So let's just go ahead and label our right triangle. I think that's a really great place to start. Oops. All right, so across from the 90-degree angle is my hypotenuse. And by the way, this is our theta. So touching theta is adjacent, and this side is opposite. But we don't know anything about the opposite side, so I'm just going to ignore opposite. The only thing that I know in this problem is my hypotenuse and my adjacent. So when I pick out my trig function, I have to make sure that I am using the one that has the adjacent and the hypotenuse. So my only option here is cosine. So let me set it all up. I know this is my formula for cosine. I'm going to plug things in. Theta is our angle measure, and we know that that's 55 degrees. We know the adjacent is 34. What we don't know is the hypotenuse. We don't know the length of that guy wire. So we're just going to set it up and cross multiply. All right, so cosine of 55 times x equals 1 times 34, which is 34. I'm trying to solve for x, which means I need to get rid of cosine of 55. Right now, I'm multiplying. The inverse is not to do inverse cosine. To get rid of multiplying, you have to divide. So every time you see a problem, you have to ask yourself, okay, how would that cancel? What would I need to do to make it go away? So cosine of 55 would cancel, leaving me with just x. And then I would type this in my calculator. 34 divided by the cosine of 55. So we could either use the fraction button or we could use the division button. So 34 divided by cosine of 55 is approximately 59 feet. And just as a reminder, you could have also done 34 divided by, if you didn't have the fraction button, and then figure out the cosine of 55. You would get the same thing. Now on the computer calculator, you need to get cosine of 55 first, and then do 34 divided by that. So let me show you that too, since I'm on a roll. Let me clear this out. We would want to do, oh man, I gotta make it big. I think it was 55. I already forgot my angle measure. Yes, 55. Okay, so 55 cosine, which is 0.57, and then we're going to do 35 divided by 0.573, whatever that is. And you still see that we'll get approximately, wait a minute, it's not even close, but it's close enough to pick out the right answer. So the approximating on the computer calculator does mess you up a little bit, but it's still close enough. If you get 60, you know that the closest answer is 59. Okay, good luck on your quiz, and make sure you learn how to use your calculator because it's all about calculator use on these problems.